learn from Saint Lucia. The webinar today is organized by the UN Climate Change Regional Collaboration Center for the Caribbean, based in St. George's, Grenada, along with our co-organizers through a partnership that we have established. So these organizations include NDC Partnership, United Nations Development Program, United Nations Environment Program, and the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. My name is Jason Williams. I am the NDC and LT-LEDS Regional Specialist assigned to the RCC Caribbean, and I'm happy to be your moderator for today's session. Before we get started, I'll just go over some brief housekeeping. So please mute your microphones and turn off your camera unless you are speaking. Please raise your virtual hand during the Q&A session if you'd like to take the floor or write a question in the chat. The session is being recorded and will be shared for participants who are not able to attend. The presentation shown in the webinar will be shared on our webpage. So the objective for today's session is to provide a platform for the government of St. Lucia to exchange knowledge and experiences on their NDC preparation and implementation processes. On the screen, we have the agenda. So after this brief introductions, I'll be handing over to my colleague at the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center for the welcome address. I'll then hand over to our colleague at NDC Technical Support Unit in the UNFCCC Secretariat, who'll be providing the scene setting address. We then move into our first session. This session is on St. Lucia's country experience on the NDC 3.0 preparation process. Moderator is from the NDC Partnership, and we have two presenters, one from the government of St. Lucia and the other from Climate Analytics. After the first session, I'll ask the participants on the call to briefly turn on your camera for us to capture a family photo. And then we move into our second session. The second session will be on St. Lucia's NDC, so moving from planning to implementation. The moderator is from UNDP, and our presenter is from the government of St. Lucia. And then we go into our closing. So again, thank you everyone for joining. Please again, keep your microphones and cameras off for now. And then we move into our opening remarks. So I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Tracy Smith, our NDC Regional Coordinator at the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. Tracy will be providing the opening remarks on behalf of the co-organizers here today. So Tracy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason, and hopefully you can hear me well.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good morning, colleagues. Good day. I know I've sent the email just moments ago to a wide network as well. So hoping that anyone joined us, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, colleagues. And thank you for joining us from wherever you are. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to deliver the opening remarks for today's webinar as we spotlight the journey for St. Lucia, a Caribbean nation that we know has time and time again made the step forward with boldness and clarity and showcasing their leadership in our climate journey for the region. St. Lucia is the first small island and developing state to submit their NDC 3.0 for this year. And this particular milestone is not only commendable, but it's symbolic as well. It reaffirms the region's unwavering commitment to the Paris Agreement and its goals, despite the persistent and disproportionate challenges that we face here within the region. And we know that these issues surround climate financing, access to that financing, and being able to respond quickly and within a timely manner. As many of you are also aware, our Caribbean region contribute negligibly to the global greenhouse gases, and yet we are expected to sit on the front line of those climate impacts, whether those be rising frequency of extreme weather events or loss of biodiversity has been recorded in some of our countries, or mounting pressures on the coastal and or even our food systems. These realities translate or shape every aspect of our development as we go forward. And it demands that our climate ambition be matched with that transformative and whole of a society implementation. And that's why some of our countries, as we are developing the NDCs, we're not also developing our national adaptation plan alongside those, but also developing financial strategies to go with those and an implementation strategy. So for today's spotlight on St. Lucia's experience, though it's not an isolated success, but part of a broader regional movement. Across the region, the RCC and its partners, the 5C included, we are actively supporting countries in shaping their NDC 3.0 submissions. From Antigua and Barbuda to Trinidad and Tobago, that was supported through the 5C's readiness support. And countries are receiving those tailor-made technical assistance from various organizations like the 5C's, our partners like Climate Analytics, UNDP, OCA Global, IDP, GGGI, and so on. These partnerships are helping us to fill critical gaps within our areas, such as data, institutional capacity, and our long-term implementation planning, which is very fundamental as we proceed. So today's webinar will take us on an even greater importance to showcase rather and build upon what the first global stocktake would have remind us of. So we are here collectively. This particular showcase that St. Lucia will show today will share the experience with their process for their NDC 3.0, and it's offering exactly what we hope to showcase throughout the entire region, which will be regional ownership or country ownership, or a strategic partnership that builds capacity and open space for innovation. And then thirdly, prove to be an example for institutional strengthening and evidence-based decision-making that we can so on go forward to replicate. So as we listen today to Ms. Unika Stellenberg, our colleagues at NDC Partnership, we are hoping to also explore the how and the why it was done, this process is done. So let us draw on the inspiration. I would like to invite everyone to also get involved in the conversation, the discussion, and showcase how we are able to create enabling environments that will make the progress possible for us. This would include our cross-sectional coordination, our national data systems, if those need to be highlighted, and anchoring those NDC priorities within our wider development goals. You may also know that recently the 5Cs had approved, the CARICOM region approved rather, the regional framework for climate change. After this discussion, we can go ahead also and share that with you too. The 5Cs remains committed to its hard work, hand in hand with other countries and partners. And we thank you to Jason Williams from the RCC team and other colleagues on the call for making this particular discussion possible. I now would like to wish you and all our participants all the best, and thank you, and I wish you all an enriching discussion going forward. Thank you very much. Jason, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for those words. For again spotlighting St. Lucia, we're very excited to hear about the experiences, also for highlighting the importance of partnerships and the work that's being done around the region to support the Caribbean countries in their NDC journey. So it's very well received. So now I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Sadia Afreen, who is the Associate Program Officer in the NDC Technical Support Unit, the Mitigation Division in the UNFCCC Secretariat, to provide the scene setting address. Sadia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jason, and good morning to all the colleagues. Good day to everyone. I hope everyone can hear me well.
Yes.
Thank you. So today my scene setting will mostly focus on talking about the recent NDC clinic that took place in Panama, covering Latin America and the Caribbean region, which was designed to foster exchanges amongst the countries and build the capacity of the countries to develop ambitious NDCs. And yeah, I'll try to touch on the key outcomes from the NDC clinic discussions that happened for 2 days, where we had 140 participants from over 20 countries from the region, including 7 countries from the Caribbean, as well as a lot of technical partners who are in the call today, and including 5Cs as well. So I would like to extend a thanks for all the countries and the partners that contributed to those fruitful discussions. So maybe just a broad overview of the clinic and how it was run. We tried to focus on discussions around 3 key but interrelated segments. So the first one was on implementation readiness, which covered the institutional and financial foundations that are required for an effective NDC implementation. And one of the key aspects of this conversation was for countries to share what kind of replicable governance innovations can be have been covered in the past by countries, and what could be replicated in other countries. And the example of Saint Lucia was mentioned as one of the success model that has worked very well for the Caribbean countries. Also under that segment, we heard the importance and the urgent need for legal mandates to ensure sustainability of transparency systems. We heard countries identifying key opportunities that had a lot of potential, including the creation of national funding platforms and legislative anchoring of climate action. But at the same time, there were challenges that were highlighted for the whole region, Latin America and the Caribbean, on the lack of interministerial coordination or weak interministerial coordination in a lot of cases. Also limited technical capacity within the ministries and the finance ministry engagement in the process, as well as gaps in the stakeholder engagement process. The second segment that we looked at during the clinic was on investability, which centered around the mechanisms to enhance the ability of countries to identify, prioritize, and structure climate investments. And the aim was to help countries with practical methodologies to bridge the gap between climate commitments and the financial implementation of it. One of the key outcomes also included the strengthened understanding of how transparency systems and institutional coordination are really crucial for unlocking finance, as highlighted by Tracy at the beginning. The access to climate finance is a crucial aspect for the Caribbean countries. But also the discussion covered how we can use cross-sectoral economic modeling, the issuance of green and blue bonds, and other kind of dedicated finance unit as opportunities to strengthen the NDC implementation planning process. Again, the barriers were highlighted as capacity constraint, the limitation of fiscal space within the countries, a lot of procedural bottlenecks, and a lot of challenges around underfinancing of adaptation projects compared to mitigation. Again, adaptation as a key challenge and a key importance for the region. And the third segment was focused on private sector engagement, and it looked at how we can deepen the private sector's role in NDC implementation across key sectors and high emitting sectors in the region. And we heard from all our participants in engagement that there's a lot of value in engaging private sectors, and its role is indispensable, actually, particularly in the high impact and high emitting sectors. But the discussions also kind of brought out the actionable solutions and how those solutions can really move the needle, such as providing regulatory clarity, creating inclusive, innovative platforms, and leveraging voluntary carbon footprint program to mobilize corporate engagement, for instance. But also on the flip side of it, despite all the opportunities, again, the key barrier was the lack of clear mechanisms to track and scale private contribution to NDCs, along with the high cost of verification and the risk of greenwashing without credible frameworks. So those were some of the key opportunities, challenges, solutions that were discussed at the Latin American and the Caribbean region. And I would just like to quickly touch on some of the key outcomes during the NDC clinic discussion that are more relevant for the Caribbean. And in that, I would like to mention the importance of institutional strengthening and the frameworks, and the need for legal mandates and robust interministerial coordination. And here again, and the shout out to the successful model of Saint Lucia's National Climate Change Committee, which has really enabled effective cross-sectoral collaboration at the country level. The second is fiscal integration and investment readiness, which is, and the emphasis was on aligning climate goals with national budgets using tools like green taxonomies, budget classifiers, and innovative financial instruments, and how we can support countries to build bankable project pipelines and unlock public and both public and private climate finance in the space. The third was transparency and data systems, and shared understanding was really reached on the need for strong MRV systems and digital platforms to track climate finance and track progress. This is not only for accountability, but also to support confidence from the investor side as well. And the final point is on the private sector engagement. Again, the importance of tracking and scaling private contributions to NDCs in these countries is really of utmost importance, and that was highlighted throughout the discussions. But as I mentioned, the Caribbean has challenges, Latin America has challenges, and the region as specific has a lot of challenges that we discussed. But despite all of that, I think the example from Caribbean countries in moving forward the NDC implementation and development agenda was highlighted throughout the discussions. We heard from Dominican Republic, which has been able to set a legal framework, and fiscal incentives there have really expanded access to concessional funding. We heard from Jamaica, which is currently working on the GCF country program strategy to unify ministries under a single coordination framework for climate finance. And of course, the example of the structured governance model from Saint Lucia as best practices. So without taking more time, I would pass the floor back to Jason so we can delve right into the discussion on this great example. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Jason, for the invitation to be here.
Thank you very much, Sadia, for setting the scene. It's quite evident that some key topics were discussed at the NDC clinic. It's good to hear that the countries were well represented, and thanks again for sharing the key priorities that were discussed as it relates to the Caribbean. So without further ado, I'd like to jump straight into the first session. I'll hand over now to my colleague, Jennifer Hannah Collado, the LAC Regional Manager from NDC Partnership, who'll be moderating this session. Over to you, Jen.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Hi, everybody. As Jason mentioned, I'm Jennifer Hannah Collado. I'm the Regional Manager for Latin America and the Caribbean at the NDC Partnership Support Unit. So I'm very honored to be moderating this panel today, which is like the reason why we're all together here to see how Saint Lucia went through their experience and processes of developing the NDC 3.0. And as Tracy mentioned, was the first country in the region to submit to the UNFCCC. For today's panel, we have two presentations. The first one is going to be by Yonica Ben, who is the NDC Partnership in-country facilitator in Saint Lucia. So she will be sharing with us all the process and let's say good practices, challenges, lessons learned from the process, so we can hope this serve for other countries that are going through the process, and maybe serve as inspiration to go overcome those challenges as well. And then we have Jan Stitt from Climate Analytics, who were supporting Saint Lucia to this process as well. So let me just first introduce Onika, which is going to be our first panelist. As mentioned, Onika is the NDC Partnership in-country facilitator in Saint Lucia. She has extensive experience in policy and program development with a specific focus on climate policy, resource mobilization, stakeholder engagement, and coordination of the NDC implementation. Onika is a regionally recognized youth leader and youth development specialist, and was recognized in 2023 as one of the top 10 Regional Youth of the Year awardees in the Caribbean. She was instrumental in coordinating stakeholder engagement and data collection of Saint Lucia NDC 3.0. Onika is presenting the NDC the NDC country facilitator embedded in the Department of Sustainable Development of the government Saint Lucia. And of course, as we mentioned before, she was a key instrument on the process of developing the NDC in the country. So before giving the floor to Onika, just wanted to make sure that that we can focus on this specific angles of the presentation. And what we asked Onika to share with us today was, let's say, 4 big ideas and angles. So the first one was the vision of the NDC 3.0 in Saint Lucia. What were the approaches and best practices that she can share with us? What were the key improvements from this past NDC, let's call it 2.0 to the 3.0? And were there any enabling mechanisms that supported the processes? So this is all to maybe set the scene and hear from Onika on how Saint Lucia went through this process of the developing the NDC 3.0. So Onika, the floor is yours. Let's hear it.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. Just thanks to the coordinators for today's session. It's a pleasure to be here to share once again St. Lucia's experiences. I hope that the information is well received and it can truly help, those other countries that are still in the process of developing their document and outside of developing their document, ensuring that they can have a robust climate change program within their country. So as mentioned, I'm the NDC and country facilitator from NDC Partnership, and I'm embedded in the Department of Sustainable Development within the government of St. Lucia, and it's my pleasure to deliver this presentation on their behalf. Next, please. So before I go into outlining the 4 key points that Jennifer mentioned, just a couple of things for us to consider. So St. Lucia's NDC was submitted on February 6th, 2025. So this was in advance of the February 10th deadline that parties set for submission of all NDCs 9 months in advance of COP30 in Belém, Brazil. So funding and technical support for our NDC, whilst we got the technical support from climate analytics specifically, it was through a regional project that is currently undergoing, I believe, across 5 countries. The title is Supporting the Implementation of NDCs in the Caribbean, Transforming the Transport and Energy Sectors Towards a Low Carbon and Resilient Climate Future, NDC Tech for short. So that's the project that we received support from to develop and submit our NDC. And the main institutional mechanism that we utilized to actually guide the development of this document was the National Climate Change Committee. And the process was led by the Department of Sustainable Development, where I'm embedded. The department is the UNFCCC focal point and the climate change focal point for St. Lucia. So they're responsible for leading the development of all key national climate change policies and plans in the island as guided and directed by stakeholders. Next slide, please. So the first thing we need to look at was the vision. What was the vision that we had for developing our NDC? Now, before we even started developing our NDC, we had an initial call with Climate Analytics back in 2023. This was to the latter part of 2023 to discuss what we wanted this NDC to look like, what were some of the sectors that we were considering to include in this document. And the main vision we had was to have a more robust document than our previous submission to ensure that it could have been more ambitious in response to the global stocktake demands and outside of the ambition to ensure that it was grounded by sound evidence as guided by stakeholders. We did not want to submit a document that was only seen by a small group of individuals. We wanted to ensure that whatever we put into this document, even though it needed to be ambitious, was balanced by whatever data that we could gather and analyze to input into the NDC. Now, a couple of things really helped us to assess progress in our NDC implementation. So what we had was consistent stakeholder engagement from November 2023 on right up until February 2025, even to the submission of the document. We had over 24 meetings held, and this included meetings with our National Climate Change Committee and a youth-focused consultation. Now, I'll get into that a bit more, but this is just the overview of how we assessed progress to see where we were and then to determine what we could do in this new NDC. Secondly, the progress was grounded by a robust data collection framework. So at the beginning of the process, we identified what data we needed. And during our initial planning, we worked with some of the key stakeholders to ensure that we had a detailed plan of action to develop the NDC. So even before we started working, we knew what some key deadlines, some key targets were, and what were some key actions, as well as who had the data that we needed to submit. Interestingly enough, our initial work plan had a much later submission date than February, but after we realized that we would have been submitting after the deadline, we were able to be agile and flexible enough to really work with the stakeholders to change some of our timelines for the work we were doing. And this just was underpinned by the support we received from all stakeholders engaged in the process. Next slide, please. So to tell you what the specific process looked like, and my apologies, it seemed like some of the things on the slide have pulled together. The NDC development had 4 phases. The first phase was landscape assessment. Now, during this phase, we created a document with support from climate analytics that looked at all of the key policies, major legislation, etc., that were developed from the last NDC submission date to the current NDC submission date. This also looked at this also looked at, trying to gather a list of projects that were developed and implemented over that time. And this information collectively was used to assess where we were in implementation to help us determine how much more ambitious we can be, to look at what were some of our key challenges over the past 4 years before we even started talking about NDC development. Now, this was helped by us actually having some of this data on hand through our quarterly reporting that's done for NDC Partnership. It was easy to, sort of pull up some of the projects. But working with climate analytics really helped us because they had worked with us on our previous NDC. So there was some amount of institutional knowledge from the technical support team as well as the team on the ground. So this really helped. Next, we had an interagency assessment. Now, to develop any NDC or any national policy, there needs to be a coordinating mechanism because one office cannot do it all. So in Saint Lucia's case, we had the National Climate Change Committee. Now I'll go into the NCCC a bit later on, but this is just an overview of the process, of the phases of the process. Now this interagency assessment really looked at if the committee contained all the members that were required for assessing progress based on the key sectors that we were looking at. And then if the committee was meeting on time and anything that we needed to look at to ensure that the committee had whatever resources were required to support the development of this document. After that phase, we moved into a LEAP technical modeling. Now, LEAP stands for Low Emissions Analysis Platform. And through this platform, we utilize the data that we received throughout all of the phases. At this point, we're still collecting data. And this data was put into the platform, and our experts were able to monitor we're able to create rather mitigation scenarios to show what potentially could happen based off of the projects that we had implemented, based off of changes in population numbers and upcoming projects, to really show us what is possible. From these models that were created, we had a technical meeting with some of the key agencies to really ensure that we selected a model that was best suited to our situation on the ground, that was grounded in our reality and was grounded in our specific capabilities. After this was selected, we then worked to draft the NDC around the specific mitigation scenario. And that is where we had a draft document that was submitted to all members of the National Climate Change Committee, including the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States that participated in our validation exercise, for them to provide feedback on the contents of the NDC to ensure it was sound and it covered key areas such as gender, children and youth, vulnerable groups, adaptation, and of course, mitigation. And after this was approved by the members with the final comments incorporated, it was then sent to our Cabinet of Ministers for them to give their final approval and endorsement, to ask whatever questions they had, and then it was submitted to the UNFCCC. So key in this entire four-stage process was stakeholder consultation and engagement. So our entire process was stakeholder driven. And now that we have submitted our NDC, the next phase will focus on tracking and monitoring of this document. Next, please. So now that we've seen what the focus, the development was like, we'll now go into, the improvements in the document. So NDC 3.0 has 5 focus areas: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, with the cross-cutting elements of youth and gender equality. Now, for the mitigation sector specifically, it focuses on electricity generation, transportation, forestry, and F-gases that are found in the cooling sector. Next slide, please. So how have we changed and what improvements have we put in? Now, in this NDC, with data that was received, we were able to make a commitment for the forestry sector as well as for F-gases from the cooling sector. And these are 2 new sectors that are in NDC 3.0 based off of what our stakeholders wanted to see, but also grounded in the data that was available to ensure that we made correct projections with targets that were within our capacity to achieve. Next. Now, overall, we were also able to enhance our 2030 target from NDC 2.0, and we were able to increase our emissions reduction from 7 to 14% projection by 2030. And for 2035, our new targets included a 10% reduction of gases from the cooling sector, a 22% reduction of greenhouse gases in the energy sector. And I would have mentioned, for mitigation for this aspect, it's also looking at electricity generation and transport. Although we have a 22% reduction from this sector, we are projecting a 32% conditional projection if geothermal resources are confirmed. If not, then we will be on track to achieve a 22% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And then thirdly, the new improvement was to have 32 kilotons of CO2 sequestered through forest restoration in our forestry sector. So those were the key areas that we were able to improve in NDC 3.0. And these were all in alignment with the results from the global stocktake that sought to ensure that countries, looked at their renewable energy potential, energy efficiency action, and doubled some of the data that they would have submitted from their NDC 2.0 to their third submission. Next, please. So for our mitigation targets in Saint Lucia, we have proposed that to achieve these targets, We will have wind and solar energy with battery storage. These are some of the key things that are required. Upgrades rather to our grid infrastructure to ensure that it could handle any solar, distributed solar energy that we would want to install. We need to have improvements in energy efficiency as well as an enhanced uptake of electric vehicles. Now, these are things that we thought were critical to ensure that we could achieve our targets. And as we go into NDC implementation planning, these are the areas that we will primarily focus our efforts before we look at all of the other actions that are considered. Next, please. One slide back. I think we skipped one. Oh, sorry. Yes, you can move forward. Great. So the enabling conditions that really helped us to have these improvements, as I mentioned, for our enabling mechanism, we had a National Climate Change Committee. Now, this committee is a multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder committee that guides national policy development focused in the climate change sector. This committee was endorsed by our Cabinet of Ministers in 1998 and began functioning in 1999. And it was enshrined in our Climate Change Act of 2024. So it's a legally recognized committee with legally recognized members. Now, this committee has membership ranging from private sector, government, youth, and civil society. And this recognizes that any project or any policy that we want to develop, government cannot act alone. And for the most part, we need a multi-stakeholder approach to avoid duplication, to enhance synergies, and to ensure that we adequately utilize whatever resources we have available. So this was a committee that worked with us to review the material as it was prepared and to ensure that the NDC reflected our national circumstances on the ground. It's important to know that for this committee, whilst we have legal members, there are some entities that are pulled in ad hoc depending on what policy or project is being developed. And this includes educational entities, local governments, and other organizations that can join on the committee depending on what we're discussing. Next slide, please. So the entire process for NDC development also benefits from ongoing sectoral coordination and engagement. And these are some of the things that we submit to NDC Partnership as it relates to tracking progress in our NDC implementation, as well as national level work that is driven by the Department of Sustainable Development. So one of the things that we have quarterly agency update meetings where we meet with key sector agencies to understand what challenges they have, what are some of their priorities, what projects they're undertaking, and just to take a record of the updates in those projects. From these quarterly meetings, we prepare a quarterly country engagement report that details progress in the country across our 10 climate priority sectors. And this is then shared with stakeholders, both regionally, internationally, as well as our national stakeholders, so that they can keep abreast of what's happening as well as our priorities in the country. The third thing that really helps the ongoing sectoral coordination is to have uniform data collection instruments. And this means not waiting for the development of a policy, such as your NDC, but having data collection instruments, even if it's an Excel document that you utilize across sectors to collect data that you would then analyze to produce your quarterly reports. And finally, we have a biodiversity, we have oceans, and we have a sustainable development goals committee. And these committees coordinate action within their various thematic areas. And the reports from those committees come to the Department of the Department of Sustainable Development as the climate change focal point, also as the secretariat for these three committees in addition to the National Climate Change Committee. Next, please. I hope I'm not going too fast. So outside of all of this, the development of our NDC was grounded by was supported by targeted youth engagement activity that saw a youth-focused climate change consultation with national youth-led organizations. We had over 800 youth engaged in a 6-month project called the Youth in Climate Change Project for Saint Lucia. We also delivered over 500 LED bulbs to every secondary school on the island, including the special needs institution. And all of these efforts really ensure that young people were aware of the actions within the NDC and general climate change. They knew what policies St. Lucia was implementing, and they gave their feedback directly into the project, into the NDC development process as it relates to what they wanted to see in the document. Now, this was a capacity building project that really worked with young people from national youth-led organizations, as well as tertiary institutions, to ensure that they also were able to support the development and implementation of climate change policies. So we had 11 tertiary students who were hired. They were all paid $1,000 EC per month as a stipend to work at the agencies of the NCCC so that they can get a hands-on experience of what goes into the implementation of policies. And we had a technical capacity building session for 15 youth leaders. So we have a cadre of youth who are now we are now able to call on them to participate in international meetings and other meetings that we have. And from this entire activity, we had a youth delegate on our it was our COP delegation last year. She participated in negotiations and meetings, as well as other international activities, such as 2 youth leaders from this project were selected to be trained by the Climate Youth Negotiators Program. A third was also trained through the Commonwealth Youth Negotiators Program, and one of those representatives also participated in the NDC Finance Initiative that was held in Grenada in March. So through this initiative, we're seeing how we can build the capacity of young people, ensure they understand what's happening, and provide a space for them to participate in the development of climate change policies. And the final thing I'll mention is that each secondary school signed an energy efficiency climate change pledge with simple actions that they can take to reduce their carbon footprint. And I think we have a short video that's on the next slide from one of our school engagement activities. I don't think the audio is coming through, but what they're saying is Sir Ira Simmons' students act on climate. And this was at the end of one of the engagement sessions because we wanted them to see themselves in what we were doing. Next slide, please. So now that we've looked at the NDC process, what were some of the challenges? First of all, we had to match our ambition in our NDC with the capability of agencies to implement and achieve targets. This meant that even though we wanted to shoot for the stars, we still needed to be realistic as it relates to, do the agencies have staff? Do they have the technical capacity to really achieve some of the things that we wanted to put down on paper and to achieve our targets? Just to ensure that we're not doing a document that looks good to the world, but then in 5 years, we cannot report on progress. So we had to find that balance between the two. Secondly, we had delays in data provision for technical analysis. And these delays came about because some agencies just didn't have people, the human resources to actually compile data to submit for us to analyze. And this included data from key sectors such as transport, as well as fossil fuel use in the country. And finally, one of the challenges for us was to balance ambition with uncertainty around implementation. And the example we give here is a geothermal exploration. So one of the tools that we used when we met with the National Climate Change Committee, we presented options, mitigation scenario options, and then we worked with them to help them understand what would be required for each option. So if we had in one case a very ambitious mitigation scenario, each of the technical agencies had to speak to what type of resources they would require to actually implement. And whilst we would have wanted to go for the most ambitious scenario that would have included geothermal exploration, we knew that there is uncertainty around if we'd even have that those resources confirmed. So the compromise we made was actually to have it as a conditional commitment within our NDC. Next, please. So from these challenges, these are the best practices that we would propose for any entity. First of all, the NDC development, as with any policy development, should not be isolated. We have to utilize synergies from ongoing projects and policies. There's some projects that would have the data that you need. And in St. Lucia's case, we found that there are some ongoing projects that were able to provide data that we needed. So we didn't have to go back through the whole process of trying to collect data. And as a small island developing state, we don't have 10,000 staff in our climate change unit. So we had to see how other processes that were ongoing could have assisted what we were doing to ensure that we scheduled meetings at a time that was convenient for stakeholders in keeping with all of the other requirements we had. Secondly, engage creatively and strategically. I know we want to see each other face to face, but it doesn't always happen. Sometimes we have to look at having hybrid meetings. Some meetings might have to be bilaterals just to be able to engage certain specific stakeholders with sensitive data that you might not want all other stakeholders to hear at the beginning of the process. So you have to think through your stakeholder engagement plan and ensure that you're utilizing the resources you have strategically. And this is what St. Lucia did to ensure we were able to meet with all stakeholders. Thirdly, I would say one of the biggest advantages for St. Lucia was having dedicated personnel who could lead the process. So for St. Lucia, we do have the NDC in-country facilitator. That's myself, and I was able to lead that process. Had we not had that dedicated personnel, it would have been a bit difficult with staff who are already maxed out on their workload with several other commitments coming up to really ensure that, you need people to follow up with stakeholders, to collect the data, and then to coordinate the entire process, whether it's meetings, whether it's reviewing of documents, or even providing technical support to your consultants who you're working with. And finally, but definitely not the least important, every process, and specifically for your NDC process, you need high-level champions. And in the case of St. Lucia, we engaged our Director of Finance and our Minister with responsibility for climate change matters at the beginning of the process to explain to them what we were doing and where the process was going and how we needed their support to ensure that the document was approved by cabinet and to give us that political buy-in. Now, what this meant is that throughout the process, we had sometimes one-on-one conversations with our Director of Finance where, he'd call me up and he'd say, Onika, how are we going to achieve this? Currently, we don't have the finance for 1, 2, 3. And it was important having that direct feedback and that direct line with your finance ministry that really ensured we remain grounded in everything that we were putting out. Next, please. So these are just some photos of policy and practice. The first photo on your left is our minister, who once again was present at our validation session to show his commitment to the process. And he stayed through some of the key presentations to ensure he knew what we were coming with, so that when he left, he would have been able to speak to his cabinet of ministers, to speak to them about what was happening and what they could expect in a couple of days. The second photo is our LED bulb and climate pledge sign-in at one of the secondary schools on the island. Now, this is just to show that, we actually did the work that we're speaking of. And we have representatives from our energy agency, from the Department of Sustainable Development, as well as myself, who is the NDC in-country facilitator. Next, please. And therein ends my presentation as it relates to, I hope I covered the vision, the approach, improvement, and best practices from St. Lucia for the development of our NDC. If you have any questions that we can't answer now, please feel free to reach out via any of the contact details that are mentioned here. Thank you.
Thank you, Onika. Thank you for that very complete, comprehensive presentation. I don't know about our participants, but I felt that I was going right with you in that process at the country level. So thank you so much for that. We do have a space for questions and answers, but because we don't want to hold our next participants, please, if you do have questions, can you please put it in the chat? And we will make sure that we have space after Jan presenting to provide that answers and questions segment. So thank you so much, Monica, for that, again, very complete and wholesome presentation. So moving on to our next panelist, I want to introduce Jan Sint. He has a background in international relations and global governance. He holds a PhD in political science from the Free University Berlin and Berlin Graduate Studies for Transnational Studies, and an MAA in global governance from Jacobs University and University of Bremen. Jan is the current head of Climate Analytics Implementation Strategy Team, focusing on climate mitigation and adaptation policies and projects in CITs and LDCs. Currently based in Hamburg, he is team lead and leading technical analyst for various NDC revision and implementation projects. He also works on projections of greenhouse emissions, mitigation potentials, and adaptation projects, again in CITs and LDCs, and provides technical training and support for countries in Africa and the Caribbean. So Jan's presentation will focus on that data analysis, the challenges with limited data, scenario modeling, and target setting. He will also go into this description of the approach of building the capacity of local staff to develop and implement NDC, and highlighting the importance of the role of the country ownership in the partnership for NDC development. So Jan, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I think we are a little bit behind time, so I might need to try catch up, right? Yes, thanks. Next slide, please. And I think we just skipped 2 slides here so that we can move in swiftly. Next. Thanks. So basically, I mean, also to add to what we have heard from Monica, and thanks, Monica, that was indeed very comprehensive. The main key problem we have when we want to develop NDCs is always data. And data is not just important for the NDCs, and it's also kind of not just important every 5 years, but the problem is actually a coherent one because of all of the enhanced transparency frameworks, reporting requirements, and essentially also because you cannot really develop effective policies and strategies nor projects without a good understanding of your economy and of your sector that you want to mitigate or adapt. So collecting data is actually key for many reasons, and still, due to the capacity constraints Onika would have mentioned before, we always find data gaps. We cannot really get a good NDC target with data gaps, though. So what we were trying to do is fill those gaps, or actually also include stipulations in the NDC that we need support to fill those gaps where these are maintained and where they cannot be closed with the capacities in country. But besides that, we also need accurate data in order to facilitate financing and tech transfer in many cases. And in especially CITs, this is very important because the normal situation is that everything needs to be aligned regionally to actually scale. And if you don't have data available to develop good financing proposals on the regional level because some islands have gaps in a certain sector, this is also difficult. And basically the same holds for the private sector. You cannot really ask them to invest in something they don't understand. So you need to first make transparent what the situation is and what the options are, what the technology options are, including their benefits and their costs. And then you can engage. So this is also very important for that reason. Next slide, please. The problem, however, is that for modeling efforts, at least, that you need for a robust NDC, the amount of data required is actually quite large. And this is just an overview. I'm not going to go into detail, but this is just an overview for the energy sector modeling. And you can see that besides demographic data, you need things like energy supply data, but also activity level data for households, which usually isn't really available on short notice, even though in many cases the utilities or the electricity providers do collect this kind of data. But it's for some reasons, of course, also in terms of privacy regulations, difficult to change the situation where they sit on the data and nobody else has access, and it's difficult then to make good projections of how the situation will be evolving over time. And that is, by the way, also something that is very special in Saint Lucia's case, because just before the NDC process started, basically what happened was that Lusilec is no longer a monopoly, or will no longer be a monopoly provider of electricity, which changed their mindset. In the past, they said, okay, we don't have the data to understand what we can do, but we do have the kind of financial constraints we are under because we have foreign investors and need to pay them back. And that means we have to operate our diesel fuel generator plants. With better data on costing, and especially on what renewable energy options would cost, they completely changed their mind after the monopoly is gone, and are now actually the key drivers and quite ambitious key drivers of additional renewable capacity. So these regulatory environments can also be important to unlock both ambition and to solve the data problem, because then they had a different interest in the whole game. Now, next slide, please. What can you do if you have data gaps? And mostly what we see is a coherent approach is required over time to collect data, and it develops over time. So we were lucky because we were supporting Saint Lucia since 2015 in NDC preparation. And we had a bit of a bank full of data already from this process. And we had others work also because they are interested in the same kind of problem, including on the MRV hub, actually, on a leap model in the meantime. So they were also chasing after some data and were improving model that is already developed over time in a reiterative process, nationally driven actually, which helped a lot. And this kind of situation then shows us what the situation in the country would need to focus on. So we have this breakdown of emissions in Saint Lucia, and that shows us quite clearly the energy sector is key. And that means we want to focus there. So we don't lose too much time on the other sectors with the data gaps, but rather put all the effort behind finding data to close the gaps in this particularly crucial sector. Now you can see next we have LULUCF, which includes forestry. And of course, we still couldn't solve the data gaps here, but at least we included now that this will be solved in the future through projects under readiness, under GCF readiness, hopefully with FAO's help soonish. And then the next one is IPPU, and after that closely followed waste. IPPU, the department was already collecting data, so the situation improved a lot, and we were able to improve the modeling and then add it actually as a quantitative target. And for waste, we still don't have the data, and the collection needs to be moving forward over the next couple of years before the next NDC to assess if really this is accurate, what we know, first of all, and then second, what we can do about it, what technology options might be suitable. Next slide, please. So as Unika mentioned, we developed a number of models with different assumptions and then had a discussion with the national stakeholders which pathway basically would be more realistic or suitable or feasible. And as you can see, it all hinges on the geothermal in terms of the overall level of ambition. Which is, of course, a high-risk technology in terms of I mean, there's nothing that can basically go wrong over time. You will find a resource, but you can never know how difficult the search will be. And of course, then you don't know how productive the resource is, and you don't know what the costs are. So this one was excluded and given a condition. If it's lucky enough to find conditional support and find a suitable resource in country by the time it would be online, the NDC would indeed be super ambitious. If it's not, there might be a need for other options. Next slide, please. This is basically then the number of different setups of renewable energy capacity and also electric vehicle targets for each of these scenarios you've just seen. And that's really important to have a number of options here, not because you use one of them in the end and you wouldn't want to be constrained by your modeling. We changed everything after the discussions with stakeholders, but you need something to think about and something to talk about. And I found this was very helpful for the discussion with the NCCC to have a number of scenarios and explain a little bit what they would imply, what they would cost also, and what might be realistic and where they see the problems, not least because then you can look into the next round of NDC revision and find solutions to these particular problems. And these problems don't come out if you just present one target. Then it's just, okay, this is what we have, and there is no further thinking and contemplation about opportunities. So I think this is an approach that helped. Next slide, please. And then you can see basically what the NDC targets look like, and it's a huge effort on electricity generation in the end. And that's basically also where the costs for the NDC will come from. Transport takes time because it's very hard to decarbonize that sector due to the vehicle lifetime. But electricity will bring down emissions quite fast. And luckily, of course, this also means very few actors are required to implement the target, or most of the target, because it's a highly concentrated sector still. And in most countries it is. So it's easy to start there, and it should also be a focus where emissions from electricity are high, to start there, because of the fact that you don't need to bring too many actors on board. Okay, that's it from that side. No, next slide, please. And next. And next. Sorry, we need to brush. The first thing we did in terms of capacity building efforts was to try to explain to a broader group of stakeholders what the Paris process means and how it works. And this we stole from WRI is basically showing very clearly that we need to find a pathway towards 2050 net zero. And everything we do here should be part of that. And that is a problem, of course, if you start working on project basis and start adding up projects to arrive at a target for the NDC without having a long-term perspective in mind. So what we did in order to kind of solve that, while there is no long-term strategy in place yet for Saint Lucia, is to model everything out until at least 2050 and see where we would sit with our emissions by that year that we want to be around net zero. SIDS have, of course, flexibility on that, so you just need to pick some year for ending your modeling. You might go further. But basically, that's helpful to understand how much needs to be achieved in what short amount of time. It's not very far in the future. And that understanding helps the discussions around NDCs. Next slide, please. And then on the LEAP modeling, so we provided training for that to a number of countries now, trying to explain basically what can be done, and found it very interesting because this one is simple. It's a model where you can use a limited amount of data and can add precision and detail when data becomes available, while it gives you options to actually do not only just energy modeling, but all sectors by now. And you can do integrated cost benefits calculations, which is otherwise a huge effort to do. So that's useful. And next slide, please. You can also look into the longer term as well as the finer detail developments quite easily with it and see what the load on the grid would look like, for instance, for certain periods. Thanks. Next slide. And then the next thing we are now working on, and I think this is a crucial part of NDCs, is to try to track finance and monitor implementation process. So we are currently developing that with Saint Lucia and will be doing so with the other countries in the project to help them set up systems that are adequate for the capacity they have in place. And this is not easy because of the capacities being very, very limited. But this should help in the future, not only to have data available to develop better NDC targets, but also to unlock finance, because you have a better understanding where you need to concentrate your efforts. And you can also, of course, use it for the enhanced transparency frameworks reporting requirements, which are manifold. Thanks. Next. And next. So, and this is the crucial part really about what an NDC is. Without the ownership of the government, it's of course a piece of paper with very limited effectiveness and impact. But they alone in many countries are not in place to make the NDC an implementable project pipeline. So you need buy-in from a broad group. And this buy-in needs to be developed not only over time and in a reiterative process, talking to people over long periods and trying to gain mutual understanding of what the actual issues are. But it also needs to be basically engaging a number of groups that are otherwise not working together as much and build trust between them, because they all need to pull on the rope in the same direction to implement the targets. And these are very difficult to implement. Then, of course, the bottom-up development of NDCs from sector plans is crucial, because that helps country stakeholders to understand what it actually means to implement the targets. And otherwise, this has not happened in the past. So if we were to go ahead with the 100% renewable target and find out how to reach it later, you will find that in many cases it will simply not be met because it's very difficult to understand the implications. Then the rest, I think, Onika would already have spoken to, and this is therefore my last slide then to come up now. Next, please. So this is the approach, basically just for those people who weren't here now and haven't listened to Onika, this might be a good shortcut to understand how we are operating on this project. I would like to highlight that really the crucial part is the multi-stakeholder engagement with a body that ideally is instituted by the government, like in this case, the NCCC, to gain buy-in from a broad group and to gain a full understanding across the broad group what needs to be happening and what are the real problems that need to be solved. And that usually then would also create a little bit of a drive towards solving these problems, or at least thinking about how to do it. And I think that's the crucial thing about all of these NDCs, that in the end, the implementation process depends on a number of champions to actually move things forward. Yeah, thanks. And then I wanted to, just before we close, raise one more point about the Saint Lucia case, which I found rather interesting and useful, which also Sadia Afreen had mentioned before, which is really the interministerial coordination that helped a lot in this case. And Onika would have mentioned that. But the problem really that needed solving here is to get energy, transport, and environment departments to talk to each other and to align. And then also all of these to talk to finance and to align with finance. And in countries where this doesn't happen, we are supporting a number of countries where this doesn't happen. We are still not submitting an NDC because we're still not there. We don't have full agreement, and we didn't have the opportunity to engage these in the beginning because there was no institutional setting. And St. Lucia is special because they have it and they have a very strong setting, and it actually worked. And I think that made the main difference in order to meet the timeline of February to submit the NDC. Thanks. I can leave it there and hope we still have time for questions.
No, thank you, Jen. This was a very great presentation, very clear, very like insightful of like what are the technical elements that it has to be in place, and if you don't, this is like ways to navigate it. So I'm hoping that this was very eye-opening for several of the participants that we have on the webinar today. I know that we are a little bit run out of time, but just like want to make sure like if there's any questions, please do put it in the chat. We'll make sure to like at least at the end of the webinar make sure that we have some space for an actual discussion for questions and answers. But please do not hesitate to put anything, any concerns, any questions, any specific on the chat. And we just want to make sure that everybody is heard. And if there's anything that needs to be clear, please do say it so as well. So just in order for us to keep moving along, I'm just going to go hand it back to you, Jason. And then, yeah, please do put everything in the chat so we can make sure to cover that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jen. Thank you, Anika. Thank you, Jan, for all the great presentations, all the great information that was shared. What I'll do right now is ask everyone if they can briefly turn on their camera so we can just take a quick family photo before jumping into the second session. So thank you again, and we'll just take a quick family photo now. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now we'll just jump into the second session, noting that we're a bit behind time, but I'll just give the floor now to my colleague, Anne-Lynn McPhee from UNDP, to take us through the next sessions.
Yes. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Jennifer, for moderating the previous session. Like Jason said, we're behind time, so I will just jump right into this. So this discussion really builds on the previous presentation on St. Lucia's NDC development process. We will hear again from Monica on some of the actions that St. Lucia took to move from planning to the implementation of their NDC. Onika has already been introduced, so we will jump right into the discussion. So Onika, first of all, congratulations on the development and submission of such a robust NDC. And now that this submission has been made, can you just inform us of some of the plans St. Lucia has to develop an updated NDC implementation plan, or maybe if there's an investment plan in pipeline?
Yes, thank you so much for all the comments. I'm reading them in the chat. So moving from planning to implementation, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, we have some ongoing processes, so not everything will be new to this NDC. So our youth engagement support that we had last year, it was actually from UNICEF, and we're looking to continue working with young people towards implementing some of the plans that we had in place. But we are now working with climate analytics to develop an NDC implementation plan to help us to track progress across these new measures that we have put in place. So what we're doing with this implementation plan is that we're actually working with the officers that are responsible for the MRV portal, which is monitoring, reporting, and verification, and to ensure that this plan that we're creating can track progress and respond to the needs of the enhanced transparency framework, as well as the additional reporting requirements that St. Lucia has to respond to. A part of this process will be speaking with finance and the private sector to understand where investments can come from, and we would try to put somewhat of an investment plan in place just to guide implementation as well. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you, Anika. Sorry, I was having a
Okay.
bit of issues with my mic. Thank you for sharing that with us. And just it's good to know that St. Lucia isn't starting from scratch and that the support is still being provided by Climate Analytics to work on those necessary areas to build your implementation and investment plan. So just moving to the second question, given that there's an existing plan in place, apart from incorporating some changes in the new areas, and when I say new areas, I know that you, in your NDC 3.0, you included new iterations on the cooling sector and another sector. Are there any other areas that you're going to be taking into consideration for this implementation plan that the country is working on?
So sector-wise, will not include any new sectors in the implementation other than what has been mentioned in the NDC. However, to ensure that we can monitor its implementation, we are going to have, once again, extensive stakeholder consultations with the lead sector agencies that are implementing action across energy, transport, forestry, and the cooling sector, just to ensure that we take their concerns into consideration, and whatever tracker we design, whatever targets we put in place, whatever milestone we have, is grounded in the work that they're doing. So once again, it's going to be a stakeholder driven process to ensure that this implementation plan, if we do need changes, they would make the suggestions. They would say if they want to see projects as opposed to KPIs or whatever it is. So we will work with them to ensure we have something that is fit for purpose and responds to our international reporting requirements.
Okay. So I know you've spoken extensively as to the whole of society approach that St. Lucia has taken throughout the development process. And again, you spoke about that again as it relates to the implementation process, the developmental enhancement of the implementation plan. So I would skip the next question because the next question speaks to inclusion and so forth, and the groups that you're working with in the implementation process. And in the interest of time, I'll just skip to the final question, which speaks to just tell us a little bit as to the rationale behind the reference to the voluntary cooperation under Article 6 in the IC2 section. What particular considerations shape that, how that intention was framed and presented in the NDC?
Great. So in St. Lucia's NDC 2.0, we had inclusion of Article 6. That is because when NDC 2.0 was submitted, this was back in 2021. Globally, countries were still negotiating what Article 6 would look like, what this framework might look like. And we did not want to preclude the possibility of engaging in this framework by not including some reference to it. So the idea for including Article 6 is one, because we do have a forestry sector that is working to develop a REDD+ strategy, and we do have some interest in engaging with the sector. So in September, we'll actually be having a national conversation on what this might look like for us, what are some sectors we want to include, etc. And I know this is your last question, so just one point I wanted to mention that was not included before is that as it relates to implementation, we are planning a specific private sector roundtable for September 29th, where we will engage the private sector, whether national or international, in a constructive dialogue to really understand what are some commercial viability options for investment opportunities in specific sectors, to share experiences and best practices on private sector engagement in climate action, and to provide recommendations that could address any specific barriers that exist in the sector rather, in implementing climate change action. This will feed into the development of a training plan for private sector and several other projects that we have ongoing. So just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you, Anita. And apart from the private sector engagement, are there any other engagements or entities that you will be engaging there to advance the NDC implementation process, or would it just be that particular initiative?
So that's going to be the start of the initiative. So outside of the stakeholder consultations to develop the implementation plan, now that the NDC is submitted, we're going to go on a robust communication and stakeholder engagement outreach to remind stakeholders what the NDC has inside of it, and to work with them to help them mainstream some of the elements, to help them develop projects. Right now, we are setting up a meeting with forestry to develop a readiness proposal for the forest inventory. And so we're going to continue some of that effort, not just with the private sector, but with all sectors of society, developing some robust plans for including them in action, as well as taking some of their concerns on board.
Okay, that's really good to hear, and I'm sure we'll all be looking forward to seeing what the results of those yield.
Yes.
We're pressed for time, so I'd like to wrap it up here for now and just say thank you so much for sharing with us today. I'm certain that the guidance and the insights that you provided will be useful to the countries that are working on the NDCs, both the development and implementation. I see a lot of positive feedback coming through in the chat. I'm sure you're reading them. And Jason, I'm not sure, should we open the floor for questions and answers now, or are we moving to a different segment?
Yes, please, we can open the floor. There are also a couple questions in the chat directed to Anika as well.
Okay, so colleagues, we now open the floor and invite you to ask your questions either via the chat or by raising your hands and taking the floor. I would try to field some of the questions coming through in the chat. Just please bear with me while I scroll through. So we have a question in the chat from Chandel asking, what was the best scheduling for youth or children engagement, after school, weekends, or with through the Ministry of Education?
I would say it all depends on which sector of youth you want to engage. So for our project, we were looking at students in third form as well as national youth leaders who might be outside of school and working. And one of the challenges is that within government, sometimes we tend to think of meetings happening Monday to Friday, 8 to 4:30. So we did have, some challenge engaging young people in the capacity building session just because they had to work. So we, from that point, decided to look at if we wanted to do practice sessions for the school outreach. We had virtual meetings that were in the evenings. We had meetings on the weekends, depending on who we wanted to talk with and what we wanted to do. For engaging school children, we recognize that we have to go through the Ministry of Education, and we created actually a template for engaging schools that is specific to St. Lucia. What are the steps to follow? And we recognize that between September and June, when school is in session, does not mean that you could engage students between September and June. There's still times when they're unavailable. So you still have to work with the schools to figure out when it's end of term, whether it's sports and all of these things, to schedule your engagement with it. So there's no best answer. It all depends on who you're working with and what works for them.
Okay, and we have two questions coming in from the previous segment. So the first one is from Ethan asking, what factors contribute to the disconnect between government ministries in other countries? It's a twofold question. And the second part is it primarily due to the absence of shared data infrastructure or deeper institutional issues at play?
So I see that Jan has responded to indicate the factors include capacity, lack of understanding of the financial implications of mitigation measures, especially where they cross-cut portfolio. But I'll just touch on capacity to say, when we say capacity, it could be having actual people in the office, it could be knowledge, it could be technology that you need to do the work. And then just not understanding how much something costs or where you might have implications for your various actions. Thirdly, he has lack of mandate from cabinet. And this is crucial because if the government doesn't place the NDC in a spot where agencies recognize that it's important, it will just be seen as a white elephant on a shelf, and there will be nobody leading the implementation of it. And then he has sometimes competing interests can be one of the reasons why you have that disconnect. So there's a range of issues that's there that were mentioned.
And another question from the chat before I take the person whose hand is up. Someone is asking, where is the institutional home of the LEAP? And is it the principal climate data collection, storage / analysis platform and tool?
Okay, so in the case of St. Lucia, for the LEAP platform, this is something that we have only utilized to develop our NDC, and it is not something that our technical officers utilize on a day-to-day basis. So right now, we work with climate analytics, and they have done the analysis for the last NDC, but we have access to all of the models that were created, and we are going to plan a training actually with key officers in across government agencies to understand how to do modeling on the LEAP platform, and some of the data that is provided that will be stored by the Department of Climate Change in our National Climate Change Database for use in other policy development.
Thank you for that. Justin Goodwin, you can unmute and come in and ask your question.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much to everybody for the presentations. I'm Justin Goodwin from Ether. We're a consultancy around MRV, greenhouse gas inventories and projections. And we've done our work with St. Lucia on their MRV portal. I had a question about any lessons learned considering the integration of adaptation into the NDC 3, considering St. Lucia is a small country with low emissions globally, and significant issues around adaptation, and how those lessons learned may help us understand how to engage with stakeholders, and also how the analysis of actions, particularly costs and benefits, as well as the risks to mitigation, were considered within the NDC 3.
Great. So for the inclusion of adaptation, I just say in St. Lucia's previous NDC, that is NDC 2.0, we had a more general statement as it relates to adaptation and adaptation action. But for this NDC, we had an internal national conversation as it related to how do we want to present adaptation in NDCs, recognizing that in the case of Saint Lucia, we already have an established national adaptation plan and national adaptation planning process with sectoral strategies and its own M&E strategy. So we recognize that one, NDCs are traditionally mitigation focused, but we did want to highlight our adaptation efforts. So it was just about us deciding if we wanted to use the NDC as a tool to present key adaptation projects. So we could say these are the ones we want to fund, or we could present key adaptation priorities to draw attention to the NAP, which is what we decided to go with. So we outlined some of our key priorities across the 8 adaptation priority sectors to draw attention to the NAP so that we can use the NAP now to engage in conversation with stakeholders to mobilize support. Now, as it relates to cost benefit, it's easy to cost mitigation action. Those are a bit more tangible. But for adaptation action, I'd say it's an ongoing activity across all sectors as we look at the various actions that are required to achieve resilience across the sectors. But we do have an estimated figure for some of the project portfolios that we have developed for the key sectors. So we have 8 adaptation priority sectors, and for each of the sector, we try to develop priority project portfolios, and those are costed. And so those are the costs we usually lead with, and anything else we then work with that. I hope I answered your question, Justin. And nice to see you. My first time seeing you. I know you've done extensive work with Saint Lucia as well.
All right, I don't see any more hands up or any more questions in the chat. Colleagues, we're just giving you one quick chance to ask your questions before we hand over to Jason to take us forward. Okay, so Onika, once again, thank you so much. And Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Annalyn. Thank you, Anika. So as we come to the end of our webinar today, I'd like to thank everyone who attended and participated in the sessions. I would like to acknowledge our co-organizers, the NDC Partnership, United Nations Development Program, United Nations Environment Program, and the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center for collaborating with us to host today's event. We look forward to delivering more webinars together in the future. To our moderators, Jennifer Hannah Colado from NDCP and Annalyn McPhee from UNDP, thank you very much for your moderation skills. To our speakers, Anika Ben and Jan Sint, thank you for the excellent job that you did. I'm positive that the participants benefited greatly from your knowledge and the information shared. Saint Lucia continues to serve as an encouragement to the rest of the region, and we look forward to more Caribbean countries completing and submitting their NDCs in the upcoming days and weeks. The webpage link will be shared with all participants in the upcoming days, and you'll have access to the recording, and you'll also have access to the presentations from today. For any further information, you can always reach out to us at the UNFCCC RCC Caribbean. Thank you for attending again, and thank you for your participation today. So with that, I would now end the webinar, and we'll be in contact shortly. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.